So as you can clearly tell, custom events are important, an important feature for component communication. Now, just as with props, you can define them. You can let Vue know about the events your component will emit. For props, this is actually required. For events, it's recommended. Now, I'll just close this here to gain some space. The props are still there. I'm just collapsing this so that it takes up less space. And I'll add a new property to the friend contact configuration object. And that's the emits property. Now, emits, so to say, is the counterpart to props. In props, you define which props this component receives. In emits, you define which custom events your component will eventually at some point emit. And you're doing this to document your component, to make it obvious to other developers how your component works and to which events they can listen. This is simply useful. It makes it easier to understand your component. Because otherwise I have to look through all your code to see that there is some code where you emit toggle favorite. With emits, you would simply add toggle favorite here as a string to this array, and that would make it clear that there definitely is some code in your component which leads to an event with that identifier to be emitted. And you can also take emits to the next level. This is the basic form of using it, and it already helps with understanding your component. But just as with props, you can also specify an object instead, and then add your emitted events as keys here, like this, and then provide a more detailed configuration. The configuration you should then add is a function that receives the data which you eventually will emit as parameters. So in this case, we will eventually emit an ID, so here we would add ID as a parameter. And I'm doing that to make it obvious that toggle favorite is an event that should be handled by a function that expects an ID, because I will emit an ID here. You can then also add validation here to make sure that when the event is emitted, this data, which should be part of the event, is not forgotten. We can check if ID exists, if this is truthy, and return true if that's the case, and else return false, and maybe also issue a warning in the console that ID is missing to help developers that are emitting this event catch this error. And now, for example, if I remove this second argument here and I save that and I click toggle favorite, I get an error here, but before that error, I actually also get a warning: invalid event arguments, event validation failed for event toggle favorite, ID is missing. So this is something which you don't have to add, but which can make your life as a developer easier, especially again if you're working in a team. Now let's bring this ID back, and I will not add this detailed of a validation to the custom events throughout the course, but since it is the complete guide, I of course want to show this to you so that you know this feature. Nonetheless, I will revert this here and go back to this simpler definition, which is the approach I will use throughout the course, simply to make it obvious which custom events this component will eventually emit.